Welcome to the very first episode of the Little Did I Know podcast. My guest today is Miss Liz Charles. Miss Charles is the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Women's Coalition. Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the Women's Coalition, Miss Charles?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. So the Oklahoma Women's Coalition is a statewide advocacy organization for gender equity, meaning we take all of those abysmal statistics about women's issues, women's health, criminal justice reform, and our incarceration rate, violence against women, gender-based violence, and economic security. And we try to translate some of those obstacles and hurdles that women face in Oklahoma, translate them into policy changes and social and cultural changes. And so we are lobbyists, we are policy drafters, and we write our own bill language and work with legislative champions to get legislation passed each session in Oklahoma to try to move the needle on some of those rankings. And my role is to make sure that we see some progress on that we are amplifying and elevating the right voices of our partners across the state who are on the front lines doing the work to serve women and girls in Oklahoma, and really working to, like I said, elevate and amplify their voices at the Capitol.
All right, and what was it about the work of the Women's Coalition that piqued your interest? Because it seems like there's multiple facets of the organization.
Yes. So prior to coming on board for the Women's Coalition, I worked as the government relations director for the American Heart Association. And so I was at the Capitol lobbying and doing advocacy and grassroots organizing in that capacity, and just made a lot of relationships with other advocacy organizations and lobbyists. And when the position became available at the Women's Coalition, I got all these texts and calls that were like, hey, you need to apply for this because you're always complaining and griping about women's issues. Now you can actually get paid to do it. It could be your job. So I think I went for it, and it seemed too good to be true to have a career in advocating for things that were so personally important to me. I was raised a missionary's kid and a pastor's kid, and so I had quite a bit of a unique perspective in my childhood, and that really formed my viewpoint and my values of serving your community, elevating and amplifying the voices that are most disproportionately negatively impacted by often those in power, who hold all the power, and working to build a world and a community where everyone can thrive and flourish. And so, and I also grew up watching my mom in the 80s and 90s try to fight for space and take up space as a, quote unquote, pastor's wife, who, when she really wanted to be her own person and wanted to have her own platform and her own voice. And so I would say that it was instilled in me from very early on to advocate for equality, for equity, for representation, for agency. And that was modeled very closely to me in my own home. And I got to see behind the curtain of how women are treated when they try to take up space, when women try to hold power in places that are predominantly and overwhelmingly held by men. Men, they don't like to give up that power, and they get a little scared when women start taking up that space. And that is true across all sectors. And it's an unfortunate truth, but that really was what kind of stirred inside of me when I started reading more about the coalition and considered coming on board. And so it's pretty awesome to get to work in an area that I'm so personally passionate about.
That's great to hear. I feel like everybody deserves to have that space where they really feel passionate about the work that they're doing.
Totally.
Um, Going off of like that passionate work drive you have, what is something you wish that you could explain to people who don't fully understand women's issues?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have in this podcast? No. I think if I had to focus on a particular perspective that I wish more people understood, it would be that we are blaming women and criminalizing and demonizing women for a very unique form of trauma that women experience, and then the survival behaviors that women are forced to employ and to use in order to cope with that trauma. So, regardless of the area, if we're talking about incarceration, if we're talking about poverty, substance abuse, mental health issues, lack of access to vital and core services, and then the behaviors that stem from that trauma. You know, when you start thinking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, adverse community experiences, and the unique way that women kind of cope with those traumas, whether it be violence or poverty or abandonment as a child. Women internalize that trauma, and we kind of blame ourselves and have to find a way to get some relief from that overwhelming sense of just trauma and pain. And so whether it be remaining or staying in a toxic or violent relationship because that's the only thing that women have known, is that men are violent and aggressive and demeaning and belittling, and we equate that with love because that's what we were taught love was, or if it's dealing drugs because you need to feed your kids, and you can't get a job because you have a criminal record because of dealing those drugs, or your partner has substances in the home, and you are then guilty and culpable by proximity, and it's just intensified when women are mothers. So I wish that there was more empathy. We have a crisis of empathy, and that results in blaming women for the decisions that they're not really even decisions. It feels as though they're forced into these situations. Not to say that folks shouldn't take responsibility, but you can't take responsibility until you acknowledge what got you to the place that you're in. And I think I've said several times that it seems like Oklahoma's sarcastic love letter to women is "you should have known better." I mean, I've heard it out of the mouths of those in our legal system, that there's just an implicit bias, and sometimes a very overt bias and discrimination against women, especially, like I said, when they are mothers, that we are supposed to be the responsible ones. We're supposed to be the nurturers and those that are kind and thoughtful and sweet and have it all together. And we're not allowed to be angry. We're not allowed to be broken. We're not allowed to struggle through life's circumstances, and especially those that are unfairly dealt to Black and brown women, to trans women, to LGBTQ women. It's just the crisis of empathy is something I wish more people understood. I wish folks could pause, and instead of blaming and falling into implicit bias against women, we could really start examining the systems and the structures in place in our government, in our legal system, in our healthcare system, of racism and discrimination against women, and have a real honest conversation about it, have a reckoning, have a lamenting of how we've done things in the past, and the fact that the time for change is now, and we have to do something different. and that can be exciting, that it can be exciting to dream and to reimagine what our systems could be and should be, instead of criminalizing and punishing women for their trauma.
In order to see reform in our legal system, I'd ask you, how important is voting in elections when it comes to trying to solve women's issues?
Your vote is your voice. And I know that voting is not a end all be all. It's not complete, but it is something, and it is vital. I think we've seen a significant shift even here locally in Oklahoma City and Oklahoma, in representation, and what happens when we have representation in office that actually elevates our voices and the concerns of their community that they're charged with representing. I saw a significant shift when we elected more women into the Oklahoma legislature, in the Senate, in the House. Whether they were Republican or Democrat really didn't matter. It was the fact that we had this voice that was finally diversifying the conversation and bringing really informed, educated, thoughtful questions and debate to the conversation happening at the Capitol. And there was some pushback because of that, because anytime you disrupt power and that power dynamic, there are going to be people, particularly white men, who aren't huge fans of that disruption. But I think voting for people, regardless of political party, voting for people who are saying and talking about the issues, amplifying the issues that are truly representative of you and your community. There's no better feeling than going to the voting booth, to the ballot box, and filling in that square next to someone's name that you truly believe in, that you truly trust. And when they get elected, there's no better feeling than that. As a voter, as an active, member, participating in civic engagement. And voting matters. There are elections, if you go through and kind of see the percentages of the people who won, there are some votes who came with it, or there's some campaigns or positions that come within 4 votes, or come within less than 100 votes. It's, especially local elections are so important. When you start talking about your DA, sheriff, your city council person, your school board member, all of those things really, really matter. And they play such a significant role in the decision making that then influences what our community looks like. So vote. It's not, like I said, it's not the only thing we should be doing, but we should be doing it.
In addition to voting, what are some organizations that listeners should be supporting?
Oh my goodness, that is a loaded question. There are so many amazing nonprofits. We have one of the most philanthropic states in the country. And so many of the folks that we work with and our partners across the state are just so collaborative, so open to building power together to address needs instead of operating in these silos. I would say some of the best organizations that I know that are really on the leading edge of change are Women in Recovery in Tulsa, which is an alternative program. Instead of sending women to be incarcerated for substance abuse and for drug charges, they rehabilitate women, offer therapy, access to resources, job placement, all of the things, housing, transportation, all the things that we all need to be able to live and thrive in our world. And so it's such a beautiful concept to say, hey, you messed up, you made this mistake, and we understand why you did, because that was a really crummy, hand of cards that were dealt to you. And so here we're going to give you this opportunity to take ownership of your life and have access to resources that you've never had before, that you should that you deserve, that every person deserves the opportunity to thrive in their community. And then similarly to Women in Recovery, there's Remerge here in Oklahoma City, that essentially does the same thing for mothers. So they work with DHS and work with the legal system to help that mother with parenting skills, coping skills, along with all of the other services that I listed before. And just a wonderful program. One of my favorite events is to go to their annual graduations and to get to hear directly from the women who were a part of the program and now have graduated out and are, ready to go crush life. So that's kind of more so on like the criminal justice end. I mean, Sue Ann Arnall and her foundation, they are doing amazing work on keeping people out of prison, out of jail, trying to reduce the mass incarceration rate that we have in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's for Criminal Justice Reform, ACLU of Oklahoma. We have some great folks on the ground doing work in reducing our our mass incarceration. What else? As far as violence prevention goes, Yes All Daughters, led by Stacy Wright. They're doing amazing work on violence prevention. So trying to, instead of like treating a crisis once it's already occurred, let's teach our kiddos in kindergarten through 5th grade and high school to learn about consent. Let's teach them about actual evidence-based sex education in schools. We're really working with partners across the state, whether it be George Kaiser Family Foundation, Thrive here in Oklahoma City, Amplify out of Tulsa, and others to bring comprehensive health education, comprehensive sex education, and age-appropriate evidence-based sex education in schools, so we can start to see a shift in gender-based violence. We can start to see some prevention and some tools and resources for our kids to be able to make more informed decisions about their relationships, about their sexuality. So that's a huge priority for those partners I mentioned. And I'm happy to connect anyone listening and interested with some of our partners across the state. Obviously, like the YWCA and Palomar here in Oklahoma City, Resonance in Tulsa, and Divis in Tulsa are doing amazing work for victims of domestic violence. So many outstanding champions for women across the state, and a lot of those folks and their contact information can be found on our website under our partner page.
That's awesome to hear all of these great resources. And how can people learn more about the Oklahoma Women's Coalition?
So you can go to our website. It's okwc.org. We also have a very active social media presence. So we are on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, posting quite a bit about news impacting women in Oklahoma, news happening, with policy at the local and state level. And we also, especially during legislative session from February through May in Oklahoma, that is when our legislative session takes place, we are at the Capitol every day. And we are working to keep our supporters and our members updated on what is happening at the Capitol, because so many organizations or just people don't have time to go to the state legislature website and track bills and figure out what that jargon means. And so we really try to demystify that process for people and provide them with the information that is most important to them about policy and legislation, either positively or negatively impacting women in Oklahoma. And so we send out a weekly newsletter during session updating folks on bills and the progress made, things that we were able to stop that were harmful or set us back, and also calls to action for ways for you all to get engaged in the legislative process, in advocacy, contacting your legislator and talking to them about issues that matter to you and how you want them to vote. They work for you. your representative, your state senator, your state representative, they are your employee. They should be hearing from you. They should know your name. So we try to make that as accessible as possible for people. So on our website, there's a little box on the homepage where you can put in your email address and your name and sign up to receive those newsletters during session. If you have interest in really tracking and staying on top of what we're doing, I highly recommend that as a tool as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all this important information. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of the Little Did I Know podcast. Please feel free to reach out to us at Did I Know Podcast on Twitter and Instagram.